The great hall of the Galactic Council stretched out like a silver ocean, filled with beings from 12 different worlds. Crystal creatures that sang instead of spoke, sat next to floating gas clouds that communicated through color changes. In the center of it all, Ambassador Deho stood at the human podium, a simple wooden structure that looked plain next to the elaborate seats of other species. The Zephyrian trade minister was complaining about shipping delays again. His blue tentacles waved as he spoke about lost profits and inefficient routes. The crystalline dominion's representative chimed musical notes that translated to concerns about resource allocation. It was just another ordinary day in the council chambers. Deho waited for a pause in the conversation. When it came, he stepped forward and cleared his throat. The universal translator carried his words to every corner of the vast room. "The human delegation wishes to make an announcement," he said. His voice was calm and steady, the way it had been for the past 20 years of service. "Earth is withdrawing from the Galactic Council effective immediately. We thank you for the opportunity to participate and wish you well in your future endeavors." That was it. No long speech, no list of complaints, no dramatic gestures. Just a simple statement delivered with the same tone someone might use to decline a dinner invitation. Counselor Vextar of the Hegemony barely looked up from his datapad. The massive reptilian being's scales rippled in what passed for amusement among his kind. "Good riddance," he muttered, loud enough for the translators to pick up. "Perhaps now we can get real work done without their constant questions about individual rights and democratic processes." Several other delegates nodded in agreement. The humans had always been odd that way, insisting on things like voting rights for all species and fair representation based on population rather than military strength. Their naive ideas about equality had been charming at first, but after 50 years, most council members found them tiresome. Regent Silneth of the Crystalline Dominion sang a brief note of acknowledgement. Through the translator, it came out as, "We respect their decision and will process the necessary paperwork." Deho bowed once, a gesture that meant nothing to most of the assembled aliens but felt important to him. Then he gathered his simple leather briefcase and walked toward the exit. His footsteps echoed in the sudden quiet that followed his announcement. In the human quarter of the council station, Heejin was already busy at her workstation. As the trade representative, she had mountains of contracts and agreements to transfer. Her fingers moved quickly across the holographic interface, converting decades of carefully negotiated deals into automated systems. "Are you sure about this?" asked Minho, one of the younger human diplomats. He had only been working at the council for 5 years and still believed they could make a difference. Heejin smiled sadly. "We've done what we came to do," she said. "We learned what we needed to learn," Minho frowned. "But we're helping them. The trade routes are more efficient now. The conflicts have decreased." "Doesn't that matter?" "It matters," Heejin replied, continuing her work. "But they don't see it that way. To them, we're just junior partners who got lucky. They think they're teaching us how civilized beings behave." Across the station, Kiwu was in the data centers, organizing files with the same careful attention he had given them for 15 years. Every trade route, every defense protocol, every piece of technology that humanity had contributed to the council was being documented and indexed. He worked through the night, making sure everything was perfectly arranged. The other technicians thought he was just being thorough. They had no idea that Kiwu was creating a time bomb. In the medical wing, Young Su was preparing his final reports. The cures for 17 major diseases, the results of decades of research combining human medicine with alien biology, all carefully documented. He made sure to include every formula, every process, every detail that had made their work successful. What he didn't include was how to replicate the specific human enzymes needed to synthesize the medicines. That information existed only in human biology textbooks back on Earth. Down in the security sector, Taemin was quietly shutting down monitoring stations that had been operating for decades. These weren't the obvious security posts that everyone knew about. These were the hidden sensors, the early warning systems, the communication relays that had been keeping pirates and raiders away from the major trade routes. The Council's official security forces knew about the big threats, the ones that made the news. They had no idea about the hundreds of smaller problems that Taemin and his teams had been preventing every year. Donghyun was in the Waste Management Center, looking at disposal schedules that stretched out for the next 50 years. The toxic byproducts from 12 different alien manufacturing processes required careful handling and specific disposal methods. Each species' waste was dangerous to several others, creating a complex web of safety protocols. He had spent 20 years developing systems to safely process everything from crystalline silicon dust to hegemony reactor waste. Now he was transferring those systems to automated controls that looked perfectly functional, but would start failing within months. Mai Ray was in her office, reviewing the treaty files she had spent her career building. 3 major wars had been prevented by her patient negotiations over mining rights and territorial disputes. Old enemies now traded with each other because she had found ways to make cooperation more profitable than conflict. She wondered how long it would take for the old hatreds to resurface once her carefully maintained balance was gone. Within 72 hours, every human ship had left Council space. The evacuation was so quiet and efficient that most aliens didn't even notice it happening. Human families packed their belongings and boarded transport vessels with the same calm determination their diplomats had shown in the council chambers. There were no protests, no demands for explanations, no angry confrontations. The humans simply left, taking with them 50 years of knowledge, experience, and quiet competence. The council delegates were actually relieved. Now they could focus on important matters without having to listen to human concerns about things like worker safety regulations and environmental protection standards. They could make decisions based on power and profit, the way civilized beings were supposed to. Counselor Vextar called an emergency session to discuss redistributing human responsibilities among the remaining species. "This is an opportunity," he declared. "We can finally streamline our operations without their inefficient democratic processes slowing us down." The session lasted less than an hour. Everyone agreed that the human duties had been simple enough that they could be easily automated or assigned to junior staff from other species. After all, how difficult could it be to maintain a few trade routes and process some paperwork? As the council members returned to their quarters that night, none of them noticed that the environmental systems were running slightly less efficiently than usual. The lights flickered just a bit more than normal. The gravity in some sections was marginally unstable. These were small problems, barely noticeable. The kind of issues that a good maintenance crew would catch and fix before they became serious. But the humans who had been part of that maintenance crew were already halfway back to Earth, carrying with them the knowledge of exactly which systems needed daily attention and which ones were held together by nothing more than careful monitoring and quick repairs. In his final report, filed automatically after his departure, Kiwoo had included a simple note: all systems operating within normal parameters. Automated monitoring should be sufficient for standard operations. What he didn't mention was that his definition of normal parameters included about 1,000 small interventions that happened every day, performed by humans who understood that keeping a space station running required constant attention to details that most species considered beneath their notice. The council had what they wanted: a galaxy run by the strong and successful, without the weak idealism of human democracy to slow them down. They were about to learn the difference between managing a civilization and maintaining one. 3 months had passed since the humans left, and Counselor Vextar was beginning to think they had made the right choice. The council chambers ran more smoothly now, without constant interruptions about proper procedures and ethical considerations. Decisions were made quickly and efficiently, the way they should be. The first sign of trouble came from Captain Zelnox of the Zephyrian merchant fleet. His ship had been following the same trade route for 15 years, carrying precious crystals from the outer rim to the core worlds. It was a simple journey that his navigation computer had memorized long ago, except this time, something went wrong. "The coordinates are off," he reported to the trading post at Kepler Station. "My ship says I'm in the right place, but the asteroid field isn't where it should be." The station's traffic controller, a young Aquarian named Flixara, checked her charts. Everything looked normal on her screens. "Are you sure your navigation system is working properly, Captain?" "I've been flying this route since before you were spawned," Zelnox snapped. "My ship knows these coordinates better than I know my own tentacles." But when Flixara contacted other ships in the area, they reported similar problems. Asteroid fields had shifted. Mining platforms were in the wrong locations. Even the space buoys that marked safe passage through dangerous areas seemed to have moved. What none of them realized was that Jae-sung had been making tiny adjustments to those coordinates for years. The galaxy was not a static place. Asteroids drifted. Gravity fields shifted. Solar winds pushed objects slowly out of their predicted positions. It took constant monitoring and frequent updates to keep the navigation charts accurate. Jae-sung had been doing that work quietly, updating the central navigation database every few days with corrections so small that nobody noticed them. His updates were automatically distributed to every ship in Council space, keeping millions of travelers safe. Now those updates had stopped. Within a week, 3 ships had collided with asteroids that weren't supposed to be there. A passenger liner carrying 500 crystalline citizens had to make an emergency landing when they flew into a radiation field that had drifted 20,000 kilometers from its charted position. The Council's emergency response team scrambled to understand what was happening. Engineer Prime Vordash of the Stone Builders was assigned to investigate the navigation failures. "This makes no sense," he reported to the Council. "The backup systems show that everything is functioning normally. All the computers are working. All the charts are up to date. But ships keep getting lost." What Vordash couldn't see was that the backup systems weren't really backups at all. They were elegant displays that showed what the real systems were doing, designed to give other species confidence that they understood how everything worked. The actual navigation corrections had been handled by a network of human-operated monitoring stations scattered throughout the galaxy. Those stations were still running, but they were no longer staffed. They dutifully recorded gravitational changes and stellar drift, but there was nobody there to input the corrections into the central database. The second problem showed up in the medical facilities. Dr. Helmora of the Aquarian Health Service had been treating the seasonal flu that affected her people every few years. It was usually a minor illness, easily cured with medicine that young Su had developed during his time with the Council. But this time, the medicine wasn't working. "I don't understand it," she told her colleagues. "We're following the exact same synthesis process that worked for decades. Every step is identical, but the cure is completely ineffective." Dr. Helmora had the formula. She had the equipment. She had the same ingredients that young Su had always used. What she didn't have was young Su's modified liver. The human scientist had spent years studying Aquarian biology, exposing himself to tiny amounts of their pathogens to build up immunity. His body had developed specific antibodies that were crucial to the medicine's effectiveness. When he processed certain compounds through his own biological systems, they became potent cures for Aquarian diseases. The formula looked complete on paper, but it was missing the most important ingredient: a human being who had spent decades becoming a living laboratory. Without the cure, the Aquarian flu began spreading through their colonies. What had been a minor inconvenience was becoming a serious epidemic. Thousands of Aquarians fell ill. Their gills became inflamed, making it difficult for them to breathe in their water-filled cities. Dr. Helmora sent desperate messages to Earth, begging for help. The automated response system politely thanked her for her inquiry and informed her that humanity was no longer providing medical consultation services to Council species. The third crack appeared in the communication network. The quantum relays that connected the 12 sectors of Council space had been running perfectly for decades. They were marvels of engineering, capable of sending messages across vast distances instantly. Engineer Prime Vordash was proud of his people's work on those relays. The Stone Builders had designed the basic structure, and he considered them one of their greatest achievements. But now they were failing. One by one, Sector 7 relay is offline, reported technician Sildar from the Central Communication Hub. Sector 3 is showing severe signal degradation. Sector 11 is completely dark. Vordash traveled to the nearest failed relay to investigate. What he found made his stone-like skin ripple with confusion. The relay itself was intact. The power systems were functioning. The quantum processors were operating within normal parameters, but there were dozens of small subsystems that he had never seen before. Tiny devices connected to the main relay with hair-thin cables, microscopic processors running code that he couldn't understand, backup power systems that were so small and efficient that his people's sensors hadn't even detected them. "What are these?" He asked his team. Nobody knew. The devices weren't in any of the original blueprints. They weren't mentioned in any of the maintenance manuals. But when Vordash tried to activate the relay without them, nothing happened. Somehow these mysterious components had become essential to the relay's operation. And all of them bore tiny manufacturing stamps with Earth symbols. Jae-sung had been quietly upgrading the relays for years, adding improvements so subtle and so seamlessly integrated that other species never noticed them. What looked like simple maintenance had actually been a complete reconstruction of the communication network's core systems. The stone builders had built the frame of a house. The humans had built everything that made it livable. As the communication failures spread, coordination between council sectors became almost impossible. Trade agreements couldn't be confirmed. Military units lost contact with their commanders. Even the council sessions had to be postponed because half the delegates couldn't receive their updates. Regent Silneth tried to contact Earth directly, using the old diplomatic channels. The response came back within hours, delivered in perfect council standard language with all the proper formal phrases. The Human Federation appreciates the Crystalline Dominion's interest in renewing contact. However, we are currently focused on internal development projects and are not available for external consultation. We wish you success in resolving your current challenges. It was polite, professional, and completely unhelpful. In the council chambers, Councillor Vextar was beginning to feel the first stirrings of unease. 3 major systems had failed in as many months. Navigation, medical services, and communications were all experiencing problems that their best engineers couldn't solve. Perhaps we should reconsider our position, suggested Ambassador Corden of the Voidwalkers. The humans might be willing to return if we offered them better terms. Absolutely not, Vextar replied firmly. We don't need them. These are just temporary setbacks. Our people will figure out solutions, but privately he was starting to wonder, how had one species become so deeply involved in so many different systems? And why hadn't anyone noticed until they were gone? The answer was simple, though none of the council members were ready to accept it yet. The humans hadn't forced their way into important positions. They had volunteered for the jobs that nobody else wanted to do. The tedious work of keeping systems running. The boring task of preventing small problems from becoming big ones. The thankless responsibility of maintaining the infrastructure that everyone else took for granted. While other species focused on grand projects and impressive achievements, humans had quietly made themselves indispensable by doing the work that kept civilization functioning. And now that work wasn't getting done. The cracks were small at first, barely noticeable, but cracks have a way of spreading, especially when there's nobody around to repair them. The council was about to learn that running a galactic civilization required more than just impressive technology and strong leadership. It required someone to actually keep the lights on. 6 months after the humans disappeared, Captain Morkex of the hegemony patrol ship Thunderstrike was having the worst week of his military career. Pirates had attacked 3 different trade convoys in his sector, and somehow his forces had arrived too late every single time. How are they doing this? He demanded of his tactical officer. These raiders are using outdated ships with basic weapons. We should be detecting them days before they reach their targets. Lieutenant Granix checked his sensors for the 10th time that hour. All systems show normal, Captain. Our detection grid is operating at full efficiency. But the detection grid wasn't operating at full efficiency. It just looked like it was. Taemin had spent 15 years building a network of hidden monitoring stations throughout the galaxy's less traveled regions. These weren't the big, obvious military installations that everyone knew about. They were small, nearly invisible sensors disguised as space debris or abandoned mining equipment. Each sensor was solar-powered and could operate for decades without maintenance. They formed an invisible web that stretched across the entire galaxy, watching for unusual ship movements and unauthorized transmissions. When pirates gathered to plan raids, Taiman's network detected the increased communication traffic. When stolen ships changed course toward commercial targets, his sensors tracked their movements. The information from this network was fed into the Council's official security system so smoothly that military commanders thought their own equipment was generating the alerts. They never realized that their impressive detection capabilities were actually dependent on a human-built spy network that they didn't even know existed. Now that network was still running, but nobody was monitoring it. The sensors dutifully recorded pirate movements and transmitted their findings to receivers that no longer had anyone listening. Captain Morkex wasn't the only one struggling with increased pirate activity. Across the galaxy, raid frequencies had increased by over 300%. Trade routes that had been safe for decades were now dangerous. Insurance costs for commercial shipping had tripled. The Council's military response was hampered by communication failures that seemed to happen at the worst possible times. When Admiral Kektar tried to coordinate a fleet response to a major pirate base, half his ships never received their orders due to relay malfunctions. The pirates escaped while his forces sat in space waiting for instructions that never came. But the real crisis was building in the political sphere. Ambassador Mireille had spent her entire career preventing wars through careful negotiation and patient diplomacy. She understood that most conflicts started small, with minor disagreements over trade rights or territorial boundaries. The trick was to solve these problems before they grew into something bigger. The hegemony and the Silicon Collective had been arguing about mining rights in the Vega system for 50 years. It was a complicated dispute involving overlapping claims, historical precedents, and economic interests that affected dozens of other species. Mireille had managed this conflict by organizing regular negotiation sessions where both sides could air their grievances. She made sure that small disputes were resolved quickly before they could escalate. When tensions rose, she arranged trade deals that gave both sides economic incentives to cooperate. It was delicate work that required constant attention. Like tending a garden, it needed daily care to prevent weeds from taking over. Now that garden was being overrun. Without Mireille's regular mediation sessions, old grievances began to resurface. The hegemony accused the Silicon Collective of violating historical agreements. The collective claimed that the hegemony was expanding beyond their authorized territories. Both sides moved military fleets to the disputed borders. "This is unacceptable," declared General Thokran of the hegemony during an emergency council session. "The Silicon Collective has been ignoring established law for months. We demand immediate action." Collective speaker Veraxis responded with the electronic equivalent of a sneer. "The hegemony speaks of law while deploying weapon platforms in neutral space. Your hypocrisy is noted and recorded." Councillor Vextar tried to mediate, but he lacked Mireille's subtle touch. His attempts at negotiation came across as threats, making both sides more angry and defensive. "Perhaps we should schedule formal arbitration sessions," suggested Regent Silneth. "We don't have time for lengthy procedures," General Thokran replied. "Every day of delay allows the collective to strengthen their illegal positions." What none of them realized was that they actually had been holding regular arbitration sessions. Mireille had been conducting them so smoothly that the other ambassadors thought they were just informal conversations. She had resolved hundreds of potential conflicts before they could reach the council floor. The third major crisis was environmental, though it took longer to become visible. Donghyun had been managing waste disposal for the entire galactic civilization, and his job was more complex than anyone realized. Each of the 12 council species produced industrial waste that was toxic to several others. Crystalline manufacturing byproducts could poison aquarian water supplies. Hegemony reactor waste created radiation fields that interfered with Silicon Collective processors. Stone builder mining operations produced dust that could damage Zephyrian respiratory systems. Donghyun had developed intricate disposal protocols that safely processed these toxic materials. Dangerous waste was broken down into harmless components, stored in specialized containment facilities, or transported to remote processing stations where it could be safely neutralized. The disposal systems looked automated, but they actually required constant human oversight. Donghyun made thousands of small decisions every day about routing, storage, and processing schedules. He monitored contamination levels, adjusted transport routes when radiation storms disrupted shipping, and coordinated with dozens of cleanup crews across the galaxy. When he left, the automated systems continued to follow their programmed routines, but those routines were based on normal operating conditions. They couldn't adapt to changing circumstances or handle unexpected situations. The first environmental disaster occurred at a processing station in Sector 5. A solar flare disrupted the planned waste shipment schedule, causing 3 different types of toxic material to arrive at the same facility simultaneously. The automated systems processed them according to their individual protocols. not realizing that the combination would create a chemical reaction. The explosion could be seen from 3-star systems away. The contamination plume from the destroyed facility made an entire region of space uninhabitable. Trade routes had to be rerouted around the growing dead zone. Several Aquarian colonies were evacuated when their water supplies became poisoned by the drifting toxins. Similar incidents began occurring throughout Council space. Waste shipments arrived at facilities that weren't equipped to handle them. Storage containers that should have been recycled years ago began leaking dangerous materials. Processing stations designed for one type of waste started receiving completely different materials that their systems couldn't handle safely. Dr. Nelvara, the new chief environmental officer, worked frantically to understand what was going wrong. "The disposal protocols look perfect on paper," she reported to the council. "Every system is rated for the materials it's supposed to receive. But somehow we keep getting mismatches." What she didn't know was that the perfect protocols were actually emergency backup procedures that Donghyun had implemented for use during system failures. They looked comprehensive, but they were designed to handle problems for a few days at most, not to run an entire galactic waste management system indefinitely. As environmental disasters multiplied, the Council found itself facing a cascade of problems. Contaminated space lanes made trade routes impassable. Poisoned water supplies created refugee crises. Radiation fields interfered with communication networks that were already failing. The cumulative effect was devastating. Systems that had worked smoothly for decades were breaking down simultaneously. Each failure made the others worse, creating a chain reaction of disasters that the Council's engineers couldn't stop. Councillor Vextar called for emergency sessions to address the growing crisis, but the communication failures made it difficult to coordinate responses. Half the delegates couldn't receive their briefings. Military units were out of contact with their commanders. Trade agreements couldn't be confirmed because the parties couldn't reach each other. "We need to contact Earth immediately," declared Ambassador Corden during one of the few successful council meetings. "Whatever disagreements we had with the humans, we need their help to solve these problems." Vextar's scales rippled with anger. "We will not beg for assistance from species that abandoned their responsibilities. The Council is strong enough to handle these temporary setbacks." But privately, even Vextar was beginning to worry. The problems weren't getting better. If anything, they were accelerating. Each week brought new disasters, new system failures, new crises that seemed to appear from nowhere. What he didn't understand was that these weren't random problems. They were the predictable result of running a complex civilization without the maintenance and oversight that kept it functioning. The humans hadn't just done important work for the Council. 1 year after humanity's departure, the Galactic Council was dying. What had started as minor inconveniences had grown into catastrophic system failures that threatened the survival of interstellar civilization itself. The latest disaster had occurred at the Epsilon Eridani Logistics Hub, where 3 cargo vessels carrying exotic materials had suffered simultaneous containment breaches. The resulting explosion had torn a hole in space-time itself, creating a gravitational anomaly that was slowly consuming everything within a 10-light-year radius. Dr. Kolmira, the Council's new chief of xenobiology, stood in the emergency command center, watching the readings with growing horror. "I don't understand how this happened," she told her team. "These materials have been transported safely for decades. The containment protocols are clearly documented." What she didn't know was that those protocols had been written by Hyunwoo, and they only covered the simple cases. The real work of handling exotic materials required an understanding of how dozens of different alien technologies interacted with each other. It required knowing which substances became unstable when exposed to certain types of radiation, which combinations could create chain reactions, and which storage methods worked under different gravitational conditions. Hyunwoo had possessed that knowledge after spending 20 years studying the most dangerous materials in the galaxy. He had written detailed procedures for every possible scenario, but most of them existed only in his head. The official protocols covered maybe 10% of the situations that actually occurred during normal shipping operations. The containment breach at Epsilon Eridani had been caused by a combination of 3 factors that had never happened before: a solar storm that increased radiation levels, a gravity fluctuation caused by a nearby asteroid impact, and a slight temperature variation in the cargo hold. Individually, none of these would have been dangerous. Together, they turned a routine shipment into a weapon of mass destruction. The expanding gravitational anomaly was just the latest in a series of disasters that were tearing the galaxy apart. 2 entire star systems had been abandoned after environmental contamination made them uninhabitable. The communication network was functioning at less than 30% capacity. Pirate raids had made commercial shipping so dangerous that trade between some sectors had stopped completely, and now they were facing something even worse. For the conflict between the hegemony and the Silicon Collective had escalated beyond anyone's ability to control. What started as a border dispute over mining rights had grown into a full-scale military confrontation involving half the galaxy. General Thokran of the hegemony stood before the Council's military tribunal, his scaled hide scarred from recent battles. The Silicon Collective has proven that they cannot be trusted to honor agreements, he declared. They attacked our research stations without provocation. They have allied themselves with known pirates and raiders. We have no choice but to defend ourselves. Collective Speaker. Viraxis responded through a chorus of electronic voices that made the translator system struggle to keep up. The hegemony accuses us of aggression, while they deploy planet-killing weapons in peaceful sectors. Their expansion threatens the computational matrices that sustain our civilization. We will not allow our people to be enslaved by organic tyranny. Both sides had valid grievances. Both sides had evidence of attacks by the other. Both sides were convinced that they were fighting for survival. What neither side realized was that most of those attacks had been committed by the same pirate groups that were now running wild through council space. Without Taemon's monitoring network, it was impossible to track the raiders or identify their true allegiances. Each side blamed the other for attacks that were actually being carried out by criminals taking advantage of the chaos. Ambassador Cordin tried desperately to mediate between the warring factions. Surely we can find a peaceful solution, he pleaded. The Council has always been built on cooperation and mutual understanding. General Thokran's laugh was bitter. Cooperation? The Collective has destroyed 6 of our mining platforms this month alone. Those platforms were built on our sovereign territory. Speaker Viraxis replied. Your presence there was an act of war. The truth was that the territory had been disputed for 50 years, and Mireille had managed the dispute by creating a complex system of shared mining rights and rotating access schedules. The system had worked perfectly as long as someone was maintaining it, but without her constant adjustments and negotiations, it had collapsed into violence. The war was devastating for everyone involved. Hegemony battle fleets clashed with collective processing ships across a dozen star systems. Civilian casualties mounted as military actions disrupted trade routes and supply lines. Other Council species were forced to choose sides or risk being attacked by both factions. But the worst part was how the war accelerated all the other problems plaguing the galaxy. Military ships needed supplies that couldn't be safely transported due to the containment failures. Communication networks were deliberately targeted by both sides, making coordination even more difficult. Environmental disasters in war zones went unaddressed because cleanup crews couldn't operate safely. In the depths of the Council archives, Regent Silnath was trying to understand how everything had gone wrong so quickly. She had been studying the historical records, looking for clues about what had made the previous decade so peaceful and prosperous. What she found disturbed her. The records showed that there had been just as many potential conflicts 20 years ago. Pirates had been just as active. Environmental hazards had been just as dangerous. The same disputes over territory and resources had existed, but somehow none of those problems had escalated into disasters. Conflicts had been resolved before they turned violent. Pirates had been caught before they could do serious damage. Environmental hazards had been contained before they could spread. Looking deeper into the files, Silnath began to notice patterns. Every successful negotiation had been facilitated by human mediators. Every captured pirate ship had been tracked by human intelligence networks. Every environmental cleanup had been coordinated by human specialists. It wasn't that humans had prevented these problems from existing. They had prevented them from getting out of control. The most disturbing discovery came when she found Jinwoo's personnel file. Listed as a simple systems analyst, he had actually been conducting a comprehensive study of galactic civilization for 30 years. His reports, written in careful academic language, documented every weakness in the Council's structure. The member species have developed a dangerous dependency on automated systems, one report noted. Their engineers understand how to operate technology but not how to maintain it. Their politicians can make decisions but not implement them. Their military can fight wars but not prevent them. Another report was even more blunt. The Council functions only because humans perform essential maintenance tasks that other species consider beneath their attention. Without this support, systematic failures are inevitable. Jinwu had predicted everything: the communication breakdowns, the environmental disasters, the cascade of system failures that would tear the galaxy apart. His analysis had been so accurate that it read like a prophecy, but the most chilling document was his final recommendation. Human integration with Council civilization has reached optimal parameters for data collection. Recommend implementation of controlled withdrawal scenario to test resilience of galactic infrastructure without human support. Silneth stared at the words for a long time, trying to understand their implications. The humans hadn't left because they were angry or disappointed. They had left because they had learned what they came to learn. The entire 50-year relationship had been an experiment. Humanity had been studying galactic civilization the way scientists might study bacteria in a laboratory. They had integrated themselves into every critical system not to help, but to understand how those systems worked. And when their research was complete, they had simply left. The final piece of evidence was a message that had been automatically transmitted to Earth 6 months ago. When the first major system failures began, it was brief and to the point. Experimental parameters confirmed. Council civilization shows expected failure patterns when human support is withdrawn. Recommend permanent disengagement and alternative development strategies for human colonial expansion. The message was signed by Bora, who had been listed in the records as a cultural liaison. In reality, she had been conducting a psychological study of every Council species, documenting their strengths, weaknesses, and likely responses to stress. She had predicted that the hegemony would respond to problems with aggression. She had known that the Silicon Collective would retreat into isolation when threatened. She had foreseen that the other species would fragment into competing factions, rather than working together to solve their common problems. The humans had tested their theories by removing themselves from the equation and, watching what happened next, Regent Silneth realized with growing horror that everything the Council was experiencing had been anticipated and planned. The humans hadn't abandoned them out of spite or frustration. They had completed their research and moved on to more interesting projects. The galaxy wasn't collapsing by accident. It was 2 years after humanity's quiet departure. The Great Hall of the Galactic Council stood empty. The elegant seats that had once held representatives from 12 different species now gathered dust in the dim emergency lighting. Most of the delegates had returned to their home systems months ago, when it became clear that the Council could no longer maintain even basic services. Regent Silneth walked through the abandoned corridors, her crystalline form reflecting the few working lights that remained. She was one of only 7 beings still on the station, staying behind to document the collapse for whatever civilizations might eventually rise from the ashes. The final Council session had been held 3 months ago, and it had lasted less than an hour. There simply hadn't been enough working communication relays to contact most of the member species. Those who did attend spent the time arguing about blame rather than discussing solutions. "This is all the humans' fault," Councillor Vextar had declared, his once proud scales now dull with stress and poor nutrition. "They sabotaged our systems before they left. This was an act of war, but Silneth knew better. She had found the evidence in Bora's psychological profiles, documents that had been left behind in the cultural liaison's office like a final gift to anyone smart enough to look for them. Bora had studied each Council species with the thoroughness of a xenobiologist examining bacteria. Her reports were written in clinical, academic language that made their subjects sound like test specimens rather than sentient beings. The hegemony displays typical alpha predator psychology, one report noted. When faced with resource scarcity, they invariably respond with territorial expansion and military aggression. Their leadership structure makes them incapable of accepting subordinate roles or admitting weakness. Another section analyzed the Silicon Collective. The collective's hive mind mentality makes them efficient at processing information, but inflexible when dealing with unexpected situations. They will choose isolation over adaptation when faced with problems they cannot immediately solve. Every species had been cataloged and categorized, their strengths documented, their weaknesses exposed, their likely responses to various stimuli predicted with scientific accuracy. The Aquarians would panic when their medical systems failed. The stone builders would become paralyzed by perfectionism when their engineering was questioned. The Zephyrians would abandon cooperation the moment their trade profits were threatened. Bora had mapped the psychology of an entire galactic civilization, and her predictions had been devastatingly accurate. Silneth found the most damaging report in a sealed file marked Confidential Research Data. It was Bora's final analysis of the Council itself, and it read like an autopsy performed on a living patient. The Galactic Council represents a failed experiment in multi-species cooperation, the report began. The member species have created an illusion of unity while maintaining fundamentally incompatible value systems. Their civilization functions only through the exploitation of human labor, though they remain unaware of this dependency. The analysis continued with brutal honesty. Council species have confused technological advancement with wisdom, military power with strength, and economic success with civilization. They lack the fundamental characteristics necessary for long-term survival: adaptability, humility, and the ability to value essential work regardless of its social status. The final paragraph was the most damning. Recommendation: terminate the experiment. Human integration with Council civilization has provided sufficient data for our purposes. Continued association serves no beneficial function and may contaminate human development with Council pathologies. Silneth set down the report and looked around the empty chamber where she had spent the last 20 years of her life. Everything they had built, everything they had achieved had been nothing more than a learning experience for humanity. The worst part was that the humans had been absolutely right. The evidence was everywhere. When the hegemony faced supply shortages, they had immediately started a war with their neighbors instead of looking for cooperative solutions. When the Silicon Collective encountered problems they couldn't solve, they had withdrawn from galactic society entirely. When trade became difficult, the Zephyrians had turned to piracy rather than working to fix the underlying issues. Each species had reverted to their worst instincts the moment things became challenging. They had proven that their civilization was nothing more than a thin layer of cooperation, painted over deep wells of selfishness and fear. The humans had seen this weakness and planned. Accordingly, in another office, Silneth found Namjoon's final report to the Council. Unlike the other documents, this one had been written for the aliens to read. It was a comprehensive analysis of why the Council had failed, delivered in the same calm, professional tone that had characterized all human communications. The fundamental problem with the Galactic Council, Namjoon had written, is that it was built on a foundation of inequality disguised as cooperation. The member species believed that civilization meant having others do the work while they enjoyed the benefits. The report detailed how each species had specialized in prestigious activities, while leaving essential tasks to others. The hegemony focused on military glory. The crystalline dominion pursued artistic achievements. The stone builders built impressive monuments. Everyone wanted to be the brain of the galactic body, but nobody wanted to be the hands that did the actual work. Human participation allowed this system to function temporarily, the report continued, but it was never sustainable. A civilization that cannot recognize the value of maintenance work will eventually collapse when that work stops being done. Namjoon had included specific examples. The navigation errors that had caused hundreds of ship crashes could have been prevented if any Council species had been willing to do the boring work of updating charts. The medical crises could have been avoided if anyone had bothered to understand how the treatments actually worked, instead of just following formulas. The communication failures were the result of decades of neglecting infrastructure maintenance in favor of more glamorous projects. The Council species consistently chose short-term prestige over long-term sustainability, Namjoon concluded. They preferred the appearance of competence to actual competence. This made their civilization fundamentally unstable. The final section of the report was titled Recommendations for Recovery, but it was brief and discouraging. Namjoon suggested that the surviving species might be able to rebuild if they learned to value essential work over prestigious work. If they developed genuine cooperation instead of hierarchical exploitation, and if they could overcome their cultural biases about status and social worth. However, he added, these changes would require fundamental alterations to the member species' core value systems. Based on our observations, such changes are unlikely to occur voluntarily. In other words, the council species were probably doomed. As if to prove his point, the few remaining functional government systems were focused on blame rather than solutions. The hegemony was still trying to organize military strikes against other species. The crystalline dominion was developing art projects that memorialized their past glory. The stone builders were designing monuments to honor their fallen civilization. Nobody was working on waste management. Nobody was maintaining the few remaining communication relays. Nobody was updating navigation charts or monitoring for pirate activity. They were still doing exactly what they had always done, focusing on impressive, prestigious activities while ignoring the essential work that kept civilization running. Silnith made her way to the station's main communication center, where a single long-range transmitter was still operational. She composed a message to Earth, knowing that it would probably be ignored but feeling compelled to try anyway. To the Human Federation, she began. We understand now what you were trying to teach us. We see the mistakes we made and the weaknesses you observed in our civilization. Is there any possibility of redemption? Could humanity consider returning to help us rebuild on a more sustainable foundation? The response came back within hours, faster than she had expected. It was signed by Yunji, Director of Human Colonial Expansion, and written with the same polite professionalism that had characterized all human communications. We appreciate the Crystalline Dominion's acknowledgement of past errors, the message read. However, humanity has moved beyond the experimental phase of our relationship with Council civilization. Our current projects involve colonial expansion into previously unexplored regions of the galaxy. The message continued with devastating politeness. We have learned much from our time with the Council species and are grateful for the educational opportunity. However, our analysis indicates that the fundamental incompatibilities between human and Council value systems make productive cooperation unlikely. The final paragraph was the most crushing. We wish the surviving Council species success in their future endeavors. Please note that Sol system remains closed to non-human traffic for security reasons. Any attempts to approach human territory will be met with appropriate defensive measures. It was a polite way of saying, leave us alone forever. Silneth stared at the message for a long time,